Welcome. Today we are going to be total nerds. What we're going to nerd out about is the hamstrings. The intent here is to look at how the hamstrings work in conjunction with the other muscles that surround the pelvis and help the pelvis and the back to move in different ways, and how to move safely and powerfully. So we're going to look at the hamstrings in quite a bit of detail today. So please hang with us. The end task that we're going to be looking at today is going to be a safe, powerful, upward-facing dog movement. We're going to look at different ways to engage the hamstrings, different ways that the hamstrings will interact with the other muscles that connect to the pelvis, and how the hamstrings can modulate and create a much safer environment for doing back bends. We're going to start by seeing how the hamstring engages and how it feels like, both from the outside and internally. So what we're going to do is we're going to start in a sideways position. You may notice here I've got this really snazzy green belt on. It's right here at my iliac crest. The hope is that by watching that green belt, you can see some of the movement that takes place in the pelvis as the different muscle groups engage and release. So I'm going to turn sideways in standing mountain, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep this thigh vertical and bring the right foot back. And we're going to take the right hand, put it back here on the hamstring, and then we're going to find that right knee and slowly push that right knee back. You should be able to feel from the outside with this hand, should be able to feel the hamstrings engage. And go ahead and release. We'll go to the second side. So left hand on the hamstrings, push that left knee back strongly. Keep pushing it back even though it doesn't move, just so you get a good feeling for what the hamstring engaged feels like, both from the exterior, with what you feel with your hand, and what you feel internally. So we're going to do a few of those right now. Inhale as you engage the hamstring. Exhale as you release the hamstring. Inhale to the other side. Exhale to the other side. So let's do a few of those on each side, so that you have the chance to feel both externally and internally what the hamstring feels like when they engage. And go ahead and release. So the next thing we're going to look at is not engaging the hamstrings, but engaging the back, the long extensor muscles in the back. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to bend the knees, and we're going to lift the arms up, stick the butt out, and notice what happens with the pelvis. And if I come back out again, notice the movement. If you can focus on the belt, notice the movement as the back muscles engage. When I lift up, stick my butt out, the pelvis tilts forward. When I come back to a neutral standing position, the pelvis balances out again. So let's do a few more of those, just so you can feel, especially the lower back, the lumbar area. So you'll inhale up, exhale down. And notice how the back feels when you have lifted here. The sternum is lifted high, the butt is stuck out, knees are bent. Notice how the back feels in that position. So what you'll notice is that when you bend the knees, stick your butt out, lift the hands, lift at the sternum, the back muscles are engaged, but the hamstrings are not. So you get a lot of tilt forward with the pelvis and no engagement at all with the hamstrings. So we've looked at two different ways to look at engagement of the muscles on the back side. So let's combine the two of them. So I'm going to take this foot back again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lift here so that I've got a lift here at the sternum, arms are lifted, butt sticking out. I'm going to start in that position and then I'm going to engage the hamstrings by pushing the knee back. And notice what happens in the lower back and what happens with the angle of the pelvis. So typically what's going to happen here is the pelvis will tilt forward. When the hamstrings engage, the pelvis is going to come back to a more neutral position. So in this position with the hamstrings and the back engaged, we have both muscle groups engaged to modulate the movement in the pelvis. So it's not one or the other, it's both. And we're going to take a look at a very fancy visualization tool starting right now. This is my fancy visualization tool here. The blue block is representing a side view of my pelvis. And the very fancy labels here designate the different muscle groups that are involved in moving the pelvis. So down in the lower right, we have the hamstrings. Upper right, we have the back muscles in the back. In the lower, we have the hip flexors, which include the quads along with the psoas and the iliopsoas. And last, but certainly not least, we have the muscles of the stomach, primarily the rectus abdominis, your six-pack muscle, which runs from your ribs down to your pubic bone. So we've got four major muscle groups that control and modulate movement at the pelvis. And if you look at them, let's look at what the hamstrings do. When the hamstrings contract, what do? They pull the pelvis back, so the pelvis tilts back like this, and release. When you engage the back muscles, they pull up here on the top of the pelvic crest, and the pelvis tilts forward and release. If we come to the stomach muscles, primarily the rectus abdominis, when it contracts, it pulls the ribs and the pubic bone towards each other, which tilts the pelvis back and release. And then likewise, the hip flexors, they attach to the front lower edge of the pelvic rim, and when they engage, they tilt the pelvis forward. So if you look at what movement results from the muscles engaging, the hamstrings and the stomach, these two both create a backward movement in the pelvis. The other opposite two the hip flexors in the back, when they engage, they tilt the pelvis forward. So we've got two muscle groups working to move the pelvis in the same motion. If the pelvis is moving back, it can be either or both hamstrings and the stomach. If the pelvis is moving forward, it could be either or the hip flexors and the back. So there's the four muscle groups that we're going to be looking at. We're not going to spend a lot of time with the stomach and the hip flexors. Our main focus today is going to be on the back and the hamstrings. We are going to look at one simple movement before we move into a prone position. And that movement is very similar to what you might do when you wake up in the morning. Lots of us, when we get up, we will extend one or a lot of different parts of the body, extend them away from the torso. And I'd like to look at doing an extension of the legs away from the torso. So on an inhale, lengthen, extend one leg away, exhale and release. Extend the other leg on the inhale, exhale and release. Extend on the inhale, release. Let's do a few more of those just to get that feeling. We're going to come back to this same leg extension when we're in a prone position. So I want you to have a certain feel for how it feels internally as you extend one leg at a time. And come back to center and release. We're going to move into a prone position and we'll pick it up from there. We're going to do some movements now from a prone mountain position. So we'll be on our bellies. And what I'd like to do is to start with your head resting on your hands. So we'll put your hands like this and go ahead and rest your forehead on your hands. I'm going to look up at the camera. What I'd like you to do with your head resting on your hands is let all your muscles relax. And notice what happens with the tilt of the pelvis. Usually what you'll notice is that the pelvis will tend to tilt a little bit forward and that there'll be a little bit of a sag here in the lumbar back. So I'd like to start like that, just to notice what you feel in your own back with none of the muscles engaged. And we're going to start engaging the muscles by using the hamstrings. And what we're going to do is to press down at the tops of the thighs and the pubic bone. So if you drew a line across the body through the pubic bone, it would incorporate the tops of both of the thighs. I would like you to push down into the mat at both of those points. And you'll notice what will happen. You push down. That is going to engage the hamstrings, and the pelvis is going to tilt back a little bit. So I will release and push back, push down with the pubic bone and the tops of the thighs. Release and engage the hamstrings. So let's do that a couple of times. I want you to just feel what is going on with the pelvis and feel what it feels like when the hamstrings do engage. So
From a relaxed position, press down at the pubic bone, tops of thighs. Notice the hamstring engagement. And release. Inhale, push down at the tops of the thighs. Exhale, release. So just notice the movement that takes place in the body as the hamstrings engage. Let's do one more and then release.
So what we're going to do next is that we're going to take the head out of a resting position and engage the neck and the back by holding the head just barely off the floor. So we'll move into a classic prone mountain position with the hands and arms and shoulders floating off of the mat. And the nose and the chin are going to float just barely off the mat. So what this is going to do is that this is going to engage the back muscles. So we're going to start in that position. Release the hams. We're not going to push anything or do anything with muscle engagement in the hams yet. Just notice what you feel with the nose and chin floating, shoulders, hands, arms floating, neck nice and loose. Notice the tilt in the pelvis. The pelvis tends to be tilted forward and lifted a little bit. So notice that to start, and then on the next inhale, I'd like you to push down at the top of the thigh, pubic bone area again, and notice what happens in the body as the hamstrings engage. So we'll keep the head, shoulders, arms all floating, and we will inhale and push down at the pubic bone. Exhale, release at the pubic bone. So the hamstrings engage on the inhale, release on the exhale. Engage, release. Let's do a few more on your own. I just want you to notice what's going on in the pelvis, what's going on in the lower back, and what's going on as the hamstrings engage and release. And release. So when you're doing that movement, at least in my situation, I tend to have a kind of a loosey-goosey back. When I release the hamstrings, the pelvis tilts forward, I feel a little bit of compression in the lumbar curve. When I engage the hamstrings and the pelvis tilts back a little bit, that compression, that kind of ill-at-ease feeling goes away because I've got both muscle groups, both the back and the hamstrings engaged. And we're going to be looking at that same sort of muscle engagement with both sets of muscles engaged as we proceed through all of these movements today. When we were still in a standing position, we looked at extending a leg away from the torso, and we're going to come back to that right now. What I'd like you to do is to rest the head on your hands, again like this, and relax everything, including the legs. And on the next inhale, I'd like you to extend one leg away from the body. And on the exhale, release and let it relax. The next inhale, extend the other leg away from the body. Exhale and release. So on the inhale, we'll engage and extend one leg. On the exhale, we'll let it release. Inhale, extend. Exhale, release. Let's do a few of those on our own. Inhale, extend. Exhale, release. I'd like you to try to keep the torso from the lower back up all the way through the neck into the head. Try and keep that in a nice relaxed state. Sometimes your neck may want to assist with some movement by clenching itself, and I want you to pay attention. Keep the neck soft. And as you extend the leg along the mat, I want you to notice what happens at the top of the thigh. So if I'm extending my left leg, what I notice is that the top of the left thigh presses into the mat. And likewise, the right leg extends away from the body, the right top of the thigh presses into the mat. I want you to notice that. We're going to do several more leg extensions. And I want you to take a hand and put it on the hamstring and feel, is the hamstring engaged as the leg extends? And in my case, the answer is a little bit. As I extend one leg, that hamstring does engage a little bit, but the primary engagement as the leg extends away from the torso is going to be the glutes. So if I extend my right leg, there's a little bit of contraction here in the hamstring, but there's a lot of contraction here in the glute, because that's what's creating that downward pressure here at the top of the thigh. So glutes do play a pretty important role in all of these movements, especially when you do a rotational movement like this. There's not a whole lot of rotation here, but the glutes are providing the rotation that takes place. And if you do this long enough, you'll start to feel here at the attachment points for the glutes, you're going to start to feel some muscle heat from that movement. So go ahead and release. We're going to add a little bit of movement now. We're going to work on the hamstrings for a little bit, see if we can strengthen them up a little bit and prepare us for some plank and up dog movements. So what we're going to do is we're going to extend one leg, same extension we've been doing, but at the end of the extension, I'd like you to bend the knee and bring the heel in close towards the butt. So this is what it'll look like. Inhale, extend the right leg and bring the heel in towards the butt. Exhale, straighten the leg and release. Inhale, left side, extend the leg, bend at the knee. Exhale, straighten the knee and release. So let's do a few of those. On your own, I want you to notice as the knee comes in towards the butt, what does it feel like in the hamstring
since the hamstring is making that movement happen. And release. So you notice when we extend the leg, the top of the thigh drops down. If I extend the right leg, top of the thigh drops down towards the mat as the glutes and the hamstrings engage a little bit. What we're going to do next is to add a more definitive hamstring engagement, and that is by lifting the knee very slightly off the mat. So we're going to keep the head in a nice relaxed state. Here we'll extend the right leg out and then lift the knee off the mat a little bit, not much, an inch at most, somewhat smaller if possible. Exhale and release. Inhale, extend the other leg and lift the knee. Exhale and release. So on the inhale, extend and lift. Exhale, release everything back to a nice relaxed state. As you do this movement, notice as the leg extends, the top of the thigh on that leg drops down towards the mat, and then the lift, slight lift of the knee happens. So extend, top of the thigh drops, leg lifts. Let's do one more each side. And release. So we're going to move from single leg movements into both legs moving at the same time. And we're going to do a double leg lift. So again, the lift is not going to be very high. It's going to be fairly small. Maybe an inch at most. So let's come back into that nice relaxed body position, and on the next inhale, push down at the tops of the thighs and lift both knees slightly off the mat. Exhale and release. Inhale, engage. Exhale and release. Inhale, engage. Exhale. Let's do one more. and release. So having the legs straight and the feet somewhat apart moves and utilizes some of the hamstrings, but it doesn't really use the inner hamstrings. So we're going to modify our alignment a little tiny bit, and what we're going to do is we're going to bring the heels together so that the heels touch, and then from having that position we're going to do the same knee lift as we were just doing. The only difference here is that knees will be together, and I think you'll notice right away that the change in alignment really changes the muscles that are used and the muscle activation in this movement. So heels together on the next inhale, lift both knees, exhale down. And let's do one more. And release. Hopefully you could feel the difference there in terms of where in the hamstrings that movement takes place with the heels together. We're going to take a look next at a pose called Sphinx, and we're going to model the back movement and the pelvic movement by engaging and unengaging the hamstrings. So Sphinx pose, you're going to put your elbows directly under your shoulders with your hands coming directly out, and if you could picture that face, you've got a Sphinx pose. Now, most of the Sphinxes look like large kitty cats, but we'll have to fudge that one. So I want you to just relax and notice what happens in the lower back. So the lower back typically tends to drop down towards the mat. And then what we're going to do is we're going to engage the hamstrings by lifting them a little bit off the mat. Not much of a lift, really more of an unengagement, a little tiny lift. And release. So on the inhale, a slight unweighting on the knees. Exhale and release. I want you to watch what happens in the lower back as we move from a completely unengaged to a hamstring engaged position. Let's do one more. So, what we're going to do next is we're going to move into a knee plank position and look at some movements from there to help strengthen the body and get us a little more accustomed to what we're going to encounter with a very long stretch in the front of the body in plank and up dog. So we're going to start in table, and what we're going to do from there is we're going to move into what's known as knee plank. So you're going to want to move your hands out a little bit because we're going to bring the hips forward into a plank position. So a straight line from the knees through the hips, through the shoulders, through the ears, something like this. This is knee plank. I want you to notice what happens in the back. You probably notice a little bit of a sag in the lower back. Hamstrings are not engaged at all in this case. The back muscles are somewhat engaged, but most of the engagement in knee plank is going to be right here in the stomach muscles. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into knee plank, and then we're going to slowly, gently bring the heels in towards your butt, and notice what happens in the lower back as the heels come in. So bring those heels in slowly and gently. Don't squeeze them in real hard, you might cramp. So let the heels come in towards your butt, and notice what happens. As the hamstrings engage, the lower back sags a lot less. It doesn't droop down towards the front. The hamstring engagement pulls the pelvis from a tilted position more to a neutral position, and the back feels more solid, a little bit safer. So we're going to move from there into child's pose, and then back to knee plank with the heels pulled in. If you'd like to add some breath work here, we're going to inhale as we come forward. Heels pull in. Exhale as we move back into child's pose. Inhale forward. Exhale back. Let's do one more. And from this position, let's hold this position here. And I'd like you to do a little bit of two things at the same time. One is to pull the heels in, and the other is to dip the hips down a little bit further towards the mat. So two things, heels in, hips down a little further. Be very gentle. Release. Come back to child's pose. So we're going to look at a little more rigorous movement in knee plank. And what we're going to do is single knee lifts. So we're going to come into knee plank, and we're going to lift one knee at a time. So let's first of all get our knee plank set. So nice straight line there. Heels pulled in, arms somewhere near vertical. We're going to bring the heels together so that the heels are pressing against each other. And then we're going to lift one knee off the mat. Put that knee down. Inhale, lift the other knee. Exhale, put it down. So on the inhale, we'll lift a knee, put it down, lift the other knee, put it down. When we do this movement, we've got a lot of those muscle groups, all four of those muscle groups that we looked at earlier, engaged here. The stomach muscles are engaged, the hams are engaged, the back, and the hip flexors. What we're going to do next is we're going to continue with that same knee plank single leg lift, but we're going to see if we can drop the hips down a little closer to the mat with one leg lifted. What we're trying to do here is to both strengthen the muscles and get them used to feeling engaged and yet able to smoothly drop down towards the mat. So let's look at that. So we'll start in knee plank, heels together, and we're going to lift the right leg and a little bit drop the left hip down towards the mat. Inhale, lift the knee, drop the hip. Exhale, come back to center. Inhale, knee lifts, hip drops. Back to center on the exhale. I want you to notice that we've got all 4 of those muscle groups actively engaged here. Let's do one more each side. And release. All right, let's get to the final couple of movements that we're going to do today. We're going to come into plank and we're going to work on lifting the hamstrings from plank position. And then we're going to move from plank into a partial up dog position, keeping the hamstrings lifted. So that lift in the hamstrings that we've been working on here is going to be crucial here as we move into an up dog position. So let's get started. We're going to start in plank, and I want you to lift at the hamstrings. So the hamstrings here are engaged up toward the ceiling. So press the knees back, engage the hamstring, feel it pull on the pelvis, and then come on down and release. We're going to do a couple of those just to kind of get the feeling of hamstrings engaging from a plank position. Up the plank, engage the hamstrings up towards the sky, and exhale and release. Inhale, engage. Exhale. If you want to come all the way back to child's pose, that's good too. Inhale, plank, and lift at the hamstrings. The knees press up towards the sky. Exhale, come down. Let's do one more. Plank, lift the hamstrings up. Exhale, down. Nice. So, what we're going to do next is we're going to come into plank, we're going to engage the hamstrings, and then we're going to drop the hips down into something that looks like an up dog. So let's have a look at it. The key here is to keep the hamstrings lifted the entire time. So nice strong hamstring engagement. So let's come into plank, engage the hamstrings up, and then very slowly bring the hips down as you press the shoulders wide, hamstrings lifting as the hips come down. And come all the way out into child's pose. Let's come back into plank. Lift at the hamstrings. Let the hips drop down. Very slowly, very gently. Hamstrings lift. Shoulders wide. Come back down to table. Let's do 2 more. Plank. Knees lift, hips sink down as the hamstrings push up towards the sky. Come on out.
Let's do one more. So one thing that we've looked at in some detail today is the engagement of the hamstrings, how they help stabilize and modulate movement in the pelvis and the spine, and how the back and the hamstrings can work together to produce a nice curved body shape like what we have in up dog. So we're going to finish with a fairly intense movement, and what this is called is elevator, butt drop, and up dog. And so we're going to move and start from a table position. This is a long table position. Notice the angle from my shoulders to my wrists. Toes are going to be curled under like this. And we're going to start in elevator, which is this. Notice the knees. So elevator, we just lift the knees off the mat a very tiny little bit. So that's elevator. Butt drop is here. This is essentially like cat pose. And then we're going to come forward into up dog. So the knees and the hamstrings lift up towards the sky. The hips drop down. Lift at the chest. Keep the lift in the hamstrings. Come back to elevator. Butt drop. Back to up dog. Elevator. Butt drop. And up dog. Come on out and release. And I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you've learned a little something about the hamstrings and how they work with all the other muscles surrounding the pelvis to both allow movement and to allow you to do safe movement. So thank you. Namaste.